Imagine this. You're camping in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the sounds of nature, the laughter of friends, and the warmth of a fire crackling in the night. The day was perfect. Clear skies, fresh air, the promise of adventure just around the corner. But as the evening deepens and the darkness begins to swallow the last traces of light, something shifts. At first, it's subtle, a strange feeling you can't quite place. A sound in the distance, perhaps, or a shadow that doesn't quite belong. You brush it off as nothing more than your imagination running wild. After all, it's just the forest, right? But then that feeling, it doesn't go away. It grows. Quiet at first, like a whisper you can barely hear, tugging at your senses, gnawing at your thoughts. You turn around, half expecting someone to be there, but there's nothing. Yet, deep in your gut, you know something is wrong. You don't see it, you don't hear it, but you feel it. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Your heartbeat quickens, and for a brief moment, time seems to freeze. You convince yourself that it's just the storm, that it's just the forest. But the thing is, it's never just the forest. You glance at your friends, each of them lost in their own world, unaware of the unease creeping into your mind. You tell yourself it's nothing, that you're just being paranoid. But as you try to shake the thought, you realize you've been here before. In that moment, somewhere in the depths of your subconscious, you know what happens next. And it's already too late. Because whatever is out there, whatever is waiting for you, it's already watching. And it's moving closer. But how do you run from something you can't see? How do you escape when the very earth beneath you seems to shift, closing in, tightening its grip? This is not a story about things that go bump in the night. It's not a tale of shadows or creaking floorboards. This is the story of the campers who ventured into a place where the rules of the world don't apply, where the land itself can swallow you whole, and where the greatest horror isn't what you see, but what you can't. Every year, thousands of people venture into the woods, seeking peace, adventure, or simply an escape from the noise of daily life. But for some, their time in the wilderness will become their last, and it's not because of a storm or a wild animal. No. For those who have ventured too far into these woods, the real threat lies in something more elusive, something beyond the reach of the human eye. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of what really happened to those who went missing, and we'll ask the question that no one has dared to answer. What was waiting for them in the forest? As we journey through their last moments, we'll uncover not just the story of their disappearance, but of something much larger, a force that has been here far longer than anyone realizes. And as you listen, remember this: some things you can't outrun. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a weekend to escape the noise, the pressures, the chaos of daily life. Just 5 friends, Tom, Lily, Sarah, Jake, and Mike, seeking a quiet refuge in the vast wilderness. They drove out to the woods, leaving behind the buzz of the city for the serenity of nature. But from the moment they stepped into those woods, something felt wrong. As they trudged deeper into the forest, the air grew thick with moisture, and the ground became soft under their feet, soaked by hours of relentless rain. The trees, towering above them like ancient sentinels, blocked out what little daylight remained. The sunlight barely pierced through the dense canopy, casting everything in a muted shadow, as if the forest was deliberately swallowing the light. The rain fell in a constant, rhythmic downpour, drenching the earth and leaving behind a sharp, earthy scent that hung in the air. The only sounds that filled the silence were the distant cracks of thunder and the continuous patter of rain against the wet ground and leaves. It was as though the entire forest was breathing, sighing with each gust of wind. Yet despite the rain, the forest felt eerily still, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Tom, the natural leader of the group, took the lead. His confidence was apparent as he looked at the others with a reassuring smile. He was the one who planned the trip, convinced the others that this would be a perfect weekend to unwind, to reconnect with nature. But even he couldn't shake the unease that was growing deep in his chest. There was something about the woods, something unfamiliar, unsettling. Behind him, Lily walked with her usual adventurous spirit, eager to explore the depths of the forest. She had no doubt they would be fine. After all, This was just another weekend getaway, another adventure in the wilderness. But there was a restlessness in her eyes, something she hadn't noticed before, as though she felt the forest watching her every move. Sarah, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "You guys are being dramatic," she said with a smile, though her voice seemed to falter just slightly. She didn't believe in ghosts, monsters, or curses. For Sarah, everything could be explained by logic. If there was something weird going on, she was sure there was a reasonable explanation. But even her skepticism couldn't erase the strange feeling that was slowly taking hold of her. Then there was Jake and Mike, the more laid back of the group. They were there to relax, to escape from the pressures of work and school. They didn't care about the forest's reputation or the old tales that some of the locals had shared before they left. To them, this was a weekend for laughter, campfires, and stories. They were here for the fun and the freedom that the woods offered. Yet, as the rain continued to fall and the trees creaked with the wind, they couldn't help but feel the creeping sense that something was off. As they ventured further into the woods, the sound of their footsteps was the only thing breaking the stillness of the forest. But as the minutes stretched into hours, they couldn't ignore the growing sensation that they were not alone. The deeper they went, the thicker the fog became. The shadows under the trees seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The light from their flashlights barely cut through the gloom. Mike, always the joker, laughed nervously. "I thought we were here to get away from the creepy stuff," he said, trying to lighten the mood. But even his voice wavered slightly, as if he too felt the weight of the air pressing in around them. Tom, leading the way, was the first to stop. Something had caught his eye, something in the distance, a shadow. No, more like a flicker, a glimpse of movement that didn't belong in the stillness of the forest. But when he turned to look more closely, there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of wet trees and the sound of rain. "Probably just a trick of the light," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. But the feeling lingered. He could feel it. They could feel it. Something was out there. After hours of walking through the forest, the group finally reached their campsite. The rain, though still relentless, had lessened a little, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. With a collective sigh of relief, they set up their tents, trying to shake off the unease that had been gnawing at the back of their minds ever since they entered the woods. It wasn't anything they could put their finger on, but it was there. A quiet tension that settled like a heavy fog. They gathered around the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with the flames. Tom was the first to speak, his voice a little too bright. "All right, enough of the ominous talk, guys. Let's enjoy the weekend." But even his words, meant to comfort, couldn't mask the chill that had begun to settle around them. As they settled into the warmth of the fire, trying to laugh and talk like they had before, something shifted in the air. It was subtle but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps, a soft crunch of leaves, followed by a slow, deliberate pace. But it wasn't one of theirs. It was too light, too careful, too deliberate. They all froze, their eyes darting toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just the endless dark of the forest. At first, they dismissed it as an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. But then, it happened again. Closer this time. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the wet underbrush. Everyone turned, their gaze scanning the shadows, the distant tree line, but saw nothing. Mike chuckled nervously, trying to ease the growing tension. "It's probably just a bear, or some other animal," he said, but even he didn't seem convinced. The sound, though soft, felt too intentional, too deliberate. Tom, his instincts on edge, stood up, looking out into the darkness. He thought he saw something, movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, no more than a flicker, just behind the trees. But when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The trees stood still, their trunks shrouded in shadows, the rain falling in a soft, steady rhythm. He shook his head, brushing it off as fatigue or his mind playing tricks on him. But as they all settled back around the fire, the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like a presence just beyond their vision, waiting. The air, once moist and warm, now felt damp and cold, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, the branches groaning as they swayed above them. It was a sound that didn't belong, a sound that made everything feel even colder. Then it happened again. That feeling, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Lily, who had been silent for a while, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't know, guys, she said, her voice low, but I swear, I feel like someone is out there, watching us. Her words seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't the wind or the storm that caused the hairs on the back of their necks to stand up. It was something else, something in the way the night seemed to press in closer, something that made the darkness seem deeper, more suffocating. They all fell silent, listening. But the silence was far from comforting. It was unnerving. There were no animal calls, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just the constant pounding of the rain against the ground. It was as if the forest itself had fallen into a deep, unnatural hush. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes scanning the edge of the camp, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. I keep hearing things in the woods, he muttered, looking around. Like whispers. Not voices, just whispers. None of them could shake the feeling that something was out there, something not part of their group. It wasn't the storm or the usual sounds of the forest. It was something more, something wrong. As the wind picked up once more, howling through the trees like a warning, the group couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was out there, watching, and it was getting closer. Every so often, the faint sound of footsteps would echo again, but they could never pinpoint where they were coming from. No matter how many times they glanced around, nothing seemed to move. Nothing seemed to make sense. It was just the noise. The noise that wouldn't stop, the sensation that they were no longer alone. Tom was the first to stand up, brushing off the unease building inside him. Let's call it a night, he said, though his voice sounded less sure than before. We'll head out tomorrow. We're just tired from the hike. But even he couldn't ignore the rising tension in the air. As they moved to their tents, the unsettling silence remained, like a weight pressing down on them. No one spoke, no one laughed, just the sounds of footsteps, the zipper of a tent, and the distant roar of thunder. The group laughed it off at first. They tried to ignore the creeping unease that had settled in, dismissing it as nothing more than the storm and the isolation of the forest. Mike, ever the joker, tried to lighten the mood. It's just the storm, he said, though his words rang hollow in the damp, heavy air. It was an attempt to convince himself more than anyone else. But as the hours stretched on and the storm only seemed to intensify, something didn't feel right. The wind howled louder, pushing the trees around them as though they were paper. The fire flickered in an unsettling rhythm, casting long, shifting shadows that danced in the corners of their vision. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife, but they tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves that the night would pass like any other camping trip. Then, the unthinkable happened. One moment, Mike was sitting next to the fire, leaning back, his legs stretched out, laughing at a joke Lily had just made. But the next, he was gone. No warning, no sound. 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. No rustling of leaves, no scrambling footsteps, just an eerie silence. The fire crackled, oblivious, the flames casting shadows across the empty space beside them. Tom was the first to react. He stood up, scanning the area around them, his voice a sharp, panicked whisper. Mike, he called, but the forest remained unyielding, the wind the only reply. Mike. Without another word, Tom and Sarah hurried into the woods, calling his name, their voices trembling in the night air. The darkness around them seemed to swallow their calls, and the rain, which had been a distant murmur, now pounded against their skin, soaking them instantly. The flashlight beams pierced the darkness, sweeping over the muddy forest floor. But there was no sign of Mike. No trace of him, not a single footprint left behind. They found nothing but the flashlight, lying abandoned in the mud. The light flickered on and off, casting long shadows before dying completely. It was as if he had just vanished. Sarah's voice was shaky, barely a whisper in the dark. Where did he go? He was right here. Her words hung in the air, heavier than the storm itself. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. They called again, louder this time, but only the wind responded, a deep, mournful howling sound that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. Back at the campsite, Jake and Lily stayed behind, their eyes darting nervously around the camp. They could feel it now, The uncertainty, the growing sense of dread that wasn't just from the storm. It wasn't just the darkness or the rain. It was something else. Something unseen. Jake glanced over at Lily. "What do you think is happening?" he asked, his voice hushed. But Lily didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too busy staring into the trees, her gaze fixed as if she could feel something moving beyond the reach of the firelight. Her chest tightened. Something was watching them. And that's when they realized. The forest wasn't empty. It wasn't just a place of trees and rain. It was alive, but not in the way they thought. It wasn't the animals, the storm, or the wind. There was something else in the woods, something that shouldn't be there. There was a presence, a force, moving just beyond their reach, lingering in the shadows. They couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but they could feel it, crawling under their skin, seeping into their thoughts. It was drawing them in, pulling them towards something they didn't understand. It wasn't a person, not a thing they could touch or see. It was something more, something ancient and invisible. It suffocated the air around them, making it hard to breathe. Watching them, feeding off their fear, their confusion, a force so old, so tangled with the earth itself, that it had become a part of the very forest they thought was just trees and dirt. Tom suddenly froze. A memory flashed in his mind. An old man he had met at a local diner, a man who warned him about the woods before they left. "The forest is cursed," the old man had said, his voice shaking with a kind of dread Tom couldn't quite understand at the time. "There are things in these woods you'll never see, and if you hear them, it's already too late." As Tom stood there, staring into the darkness, the words of the old man echoed in his mind. It's already too late. He turned to Sarah, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave," he whispered, but it was too late to run. They were already caught in the grasp of the force that had been waiting, hidden, waiting for someone to wander too far into the woods. With Mike missing, the group scattered. Panic had set in, and they were desperate, calling his name into the darkness, hoping to hear a response. But the deeper they went into the woods, the more disoriented they became. The path, once clear and straightforward, seemed to twist and turn on itself, as if the very forest was alive, changing, its layout shifting, closing in on them with every step they took. The trees that once appeared to form a straightforward trail now looked like grotesque sentinels, their limbs reaching out, pulling them further into the maze of shadows. They felt as if they were walking in circles, moving through a space that no longer followed the rules of nature. It was as though the forest had decided that it was not going to let them leave. Tom's breath came in short bursts. His mind raced, but there was no time to think. The only thing that mattered was finding Mike and getting out of this cursed place. He called again, but the answer came from somewhere else, somewhere in the distance, and it wasn't Mike. Suddenly, Lily screamed. Her voice was sharp, a cry that tore through the night, raw with fear. Tom and Jake rushed to her, but they were too late. Before they could reach her, a shadow, a hand, or something like it, shot out from the darkness and grabbed her ankle with a strength that didn't belong in the human world. She screamed again, but this time it was muffled, as if the trees themselves were swallowing her voice. It was a sound that sent chills down their spines, a cry for help that seemed to come from somewhere far away. The shadow dragged her into the forest, into the inky blackness, as Tom and Jake reached out in a desperate attempt to save her. But the more they ran, the more the distance between them and her grew. They couldn't catch her, couldn't pull her back from the darkness. The sound of her scream faded, slipping away as if it had never been real to begin with, leaving only an unnerving silence. In the silence that followed, they could only stand there, staring into the trees, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air felt colder now, like a weight pressing down on them. It was as though the forest was aware of their fear, feeding on it, making it grow stronger. But just as the terror began to close in, a figure emerged from the darkness. Mike. At first, they thought it was him, stumbling out of the shadows, his eyes wide, his body swaying slightly, as though he had been lost in the dark for hours. They turned to face him, their breaths catching in their throats, relief flooding them in an instant. But something wasn't right. As Mike drew closer, his movements were jerky, unnatural. His eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow, and his body, it didn't move as it should. It was twitching, convulsing slightly as if it wasn't quite in control of itself. Tom called out to him, his voice trembling. "Mike? Mike, what's going on? Where have you been?" Mike didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at them. His lips twitched in what almost looked like a smile, but there was nothing in his eyes. Nothing human. And in that moment, they realized it wasn't Mike standing there. It wasn't their friend at all. Mike had changed. As they stood frozen, the figure in front of them twitched again, its head jerking unnaturally to one side. And the sound it made, it was no longer the voice of their friend. It was something else, a guttural, rasping sound, as if whatever stood before them was struggling to retain the last remnants of the man they once knew. It was then that they understood. Whatever had taken Mike, whatever force was stalking them in the woods, was not finished. It wasn't done with them. Not by a long shot. As Tom, Jake, and the others stood frozen in terror, watching the creature before them, the twisted version of Mike, they could no longer deny it. Something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined was at play. Their minds raced, but there were no answers, only questions that clawed at the edges of their sanity. Mike had changed. His body, his eyes, everything about him was wrong. And the worst part, it wasn't just Mike who had vanished. The forest had taken something from them, and it was using their friend to lure them deeper, to trap them in its tangled web. Now, we don't have all the answers. What do you think happened to Mike? Was it really him standing there, or was it something else? Something darker, something ancient, manipulating his body like a puppet? Was this the forest's doing, or had something else found its way inside him? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What's your theory? Could there be something out there? Something we don't even understand, waiting to take us one by one? Maybe you've experienced something like this before, something you couldn't explain. A moment when the world around you felt off, when the darkness seemed to come alive, or when you knew deep down that something was watching you. Something not quite human. Something that had no place in the world we know. Have you ever felt that sensation? Something you couldn't shake, no matter how hard you tried? Something that felt like it was meant for you, like it was waiting just beyond the reach of your vision? Or maybe you've heard a story from someone else, someone who has experienced that same feeling of being hunted in the dark. Share your own horror stories in the comments. What's the most terrifying, unexplainable thing you've ever encountered? Was it something in the shadows, or was it something you saw but didn't understand? And remember, this isn't the end of the story. What happens next will shake you to your core. You won't believe how deep the mystery goes. Stay tuned, because what they discover next could be far worse than anything they've faced so far. Time seemed to collapse around them as they ran. The storm continued to rage, the wind howling like a beast in the night, but it wasn't the storm they feared now. It was the force, that unseen presence, that had been stalking them from the moment they stepped into the woods. Each time they thought they were escaping, they found themselves drawn back, pulled deeper into the labyrinth of trees, into the heart of something much older, much darker than they could possibly understand. The trees, the earth itself, it all conspired against them. Every step they took felt like a step closer to something else. The air grew thick with an invisible weight, making their chests feel tight, as if the forest itself was trying to suffocate them. The further they ran, the more disoriented they became. There was no path. There was no escape. Tom turned to see Sarah, her face pale with fear, running beside him. But when she looked back at him, when their eyes met, he saw it. Her eyes were black, completely, unnaturally black. Her mouth opened, but there was no sound, no scream, only the hollow, empty silence that filled the space between them. And in that moment, Tom realized it wasn't her anymore. Sarah's body moved like a puppet, her features twisted into something other, something he didn't recognize. And then, just like that, she was gone. Pulled back into the shadows, lost to the darkness of the forest, swallowed whole by the malevolent force that lurked there. They stopped dead in their tracks, breathless, hearts pounding in their chests. Tom stood there, his mind racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. What was happening? What was this force, this presence that had turned their friend into a hollow shell? And why was it after them? As they stood in the heart of the forest, the truth began to settle in. This was not just a storm. This was not just a wild animal or a ghostly apparition. It was something far older, something far more terrifying. The forest itself was alive. It wasn't just the campers being hunted by some unseen force. No, this was much worse. The forest was feeding. The forest itself was the entity, an ancient, malevolent being that thrived on the fear and despair of those foolish enough to wander into its depths. It didn't just want to trap them. It wanted to consume them, to feed off their fear until there was nothing left. It lured the curious in, drawing them like moths to a flame, making them feel safe, making them believe they were just on a normal adventure. And then, just when they were at their most vulnerable, when they had no idea what they were up against, it attacked. It twisted their minds, turned their friends into hollow shells, and fed on their terror until they were lost. The curse of the forest had been there long before they arrived, waiting for someone to stumble upon its grip. And now, the campers were paying the price for their ignorance. The land itself had turned against them, its ancient power too strong to fight, too dangerous to escape. Tom, Jake, and the others, what had happened to them was no coincidence. The forest had claimed them, one by one. But were they really gone? Or had they become part of the forest itself, feeding its hunger, becoming lost in the trees? And so, as the night continued, the darkness of the forest stretched on, its grip tightening around the souls of those who had dared enter. But even in the deep, haunted silence, there remained a question that lingered in the air like the final breath of a dying man. Are they still out there? Are the campers still lost in the forest, or have they become something else? Something the forest can feed on forever? And if they are still out there, who will be next? The only certainty is this: the curse of the forest has never been broken, and it's waiting for the next souls to wander too close to its grasp. As the last camper, Tom, ran, the storm raged even fiercer. The rain, once a soft drizzle, now fell in torrents, soaking him to the bone as he scrambled through the dark, muddy earth. His legs burned with exhaustion, but the terror in his chest pushed him forward. He could feel the presence, that presence closing in, faster now, chasing him through the trees. But there was no escape. The forest wasn't just watching anymore, it was hunting him. The storm didn't feel like a storm anymore. It felt like a final judgment, an unstoppable force, pulling him down into the earth with every step he took. The wind screamed around him, tearing through the branches, as if the trees themselves were reaching out to stop him, to pull him back into the depths of the forest. The ground beneath his feet was slick and treacherous, each step heavier than the last, and yet still, he pushed on. But it didn't matter how fast he ran. No matter how hard he tried to escape, it was always just there. The forest had closed in on him. He could feel the trees, the earth, everything, conspiring to keep him in their grip, drawing him deeper into the shadows. And then, the forest fell silent. The wind died down. The rain ceased. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. No wind, no footsteps, no sound at all. The forest held its breath. And Tom was left standing in the stillness, his chest heaving, his heart racing in his ears. The darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, heavier. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing, just the empty, oppressive void of the forest. Was it over? Had the forest let him go, or had it only been waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Tom stood frozen in place, staring into the blackness. He knew he couldn't run anymore. He was trapped. He could hear the sound of his own breathing, his own heartbeat, and in the distance the faintest echo of something moving. Something still out there. But the forest was silent. The terror, once so palpable, was now an oppressive weight in the air, pressing down on him from all sides. As the night stretched on, Tom realized something far worse than he had feared. The forest wasn't going to let him leave. No. The forest had already claimed him. And with that thought, everything went black. No scream, no sound. The night swallowed him whole, just as it had the others. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the forest stood silent, as if nothing had happened. No trace of Tom, no trace of the others. The forest remained untouched, its curse still lingering, its hunger not yet sated. But did any of them make it out alive? Or did they become the latest victims of the forest's curse? Are they lost in the woods, never to be found, trapped in the eternal darkness of that out there, waiting for someone else to wander too close to the cursed heart of the forest? Only time will tell. But remember, the forest is always watching. It's always waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far. What do you think happened to them? Were they consumed by the forest, or did they find a way to escape? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more terrifying true stories. We may never know what happened to those lost in the woods, but one thing is certain: the forest